Hi everyone, my name is Valentina, and today I'm going to be talking about Albuquerque, New Mexico, and sort of like how do we revitalize a legacy city of this kind. So first, I'm going to give some background information. Albuquerque is very rich in its history and its cultural heritage, specifically when it comes to Native American history, Hispanic, and Anglo traditions. It is also a hub for science and technology. There's a lot of universities and important labs that conduct a lot of important research, specifically in the fields of cybersecurity and biotechnology. And then Albuquerque also has a very diverse population. More than half of the residents identify as either Hispanic or Latino, which also increases sort of like the bilingual aspect of the city. I also kind of wanted to discuss why it's Albuquerque, New Mexico, a legacy city. Specifically, Albuquerque used to be an industrial city, and we have definitely seen a decline in the popularity of such kinds of cities. For example, Albuquerque used to be a hub for transportation that sort of like empower the Southwest region in terms of the use of the train. It was also a very important city in terms of manufacturing, and there has definitely been a decline in such industries. Another issue that the city deals with is poverty and inequality. Mexico in general is a state that does lack a lot of essential resources, unfortunately. Education is another very important factor. For instance, the quality of education K through 12, specifically high school, is not of the best quality, and also like the high school graduate like sample size is very low, and overall there's a need for it to become vibrant again. So in order for us to think about what kind of like innovative interventions we can bring into the city to make it thrive again, we need to identify the three main economic engines of Albuquerque. So the first one that I found was federal and military presence. There's a lot of federal groups such as the Kirkland Air Force Base and Los Alamos National Lab, which are all basically related to national security matters. It's actually very important to know that the federal government is the main employer in this region. The second economic engine I identified was the oil and gas overall like energy sector. Albuquerque actually has extensive like oil and gas reserves. And it's sort of like a hub for like the energy industry overall. And then the last economic engine is basically tourism. Albuquerque, New Mexico has a lot of well-known events that happen every year, such as the Hot Air Balloon Festival. We can also emphasize the beauty of the natural landscape. Most importantly, like we said before, there's a blend of all different kinds of cultures, and that is also something that makes it unique. So before we actually delve into the specific interventions, I thought it was important to identify the underserved populations. There's a lot of refugees and immigrants, especially from Spanish-speaking countries, that migrate to Albuquerque, New Mexico. Actually, I found that 9% of the entire state's population, it's made up of immigrant communities. Most of them find a lot of trouble with finding employment and legal aid. A second community is basically the Native American communities. There's a lot of various tribes that live in Albuquerque, and they continue their fight to overcome poverty, unemployment, and a lot of educational disparities in comparison to other communities. And then lastly, as we can see on the map that I included, people in poverty with disabilities is actually a really high percentage in the state of New Mexico. There's a lot of red areas, which basically would mean that the poverty rate is almost at like 30 to 40%, which is extremely high. There's a lot of like health disparities that come hand in hand with the poverty discussion that we had before, and how it is definitely a problem in the state. So now we're going to talk about three realistic interventions that I think will be necessary to uplift and empower the underserved populations we just talked about. So the first one basically is about how we can integrate cultural preservations of all the different heritage we discussed before and bring them in a sort of like tourism-based job creation program. So these kinds of programs will be where visitors can learn about Albuquerque and the history of New Mexico, but through their people. So basically, a lot of the underserved communities that we talked about before, can become the main like storytellers of their history and New Mexico's history to sort of like incentivize the employment market to hire these kinds of individuals, maybe for like tours or exhibitions. It may be beneficial to bring entrepreneurs or local restaurants that sort of like talk about the cultures at hand. And this would be pretty budget friendly because we would be only adding to existing programs that already exist in the tourism industry, and it will be a great way to highlight the rich history of the city. I'm thinking that an intervention that addresses the populations that have disabilities would be very beneficial. For instance, I thought about how to create more accessible public transportation stops. Like I said before, transportation used to be a key characteristic of Albuquerque, and I think want to bring that back and make it thrive again by, for example, installing wider ramps or sitting and making routes more clear. My last intervention focuses on sort of like the bilingual aspect that we were talking about before by incorporating bilingual signs, specifically in Spanish and English in the city. I would say focusing on key areas such as transportation stops or recreation areas, healthcare and emergency locations, important like city buildings, especially if we remember that almost half the population um, identifies as Hispanic and most likely Spanish speaker dominant. So lastly, I want to go over the theory of change, which is basically if we were to implement such interventions, what would be the outcome? So for the first one, I think if we encourage like cultural appeal into our workforce, it would not only create employment, but most importantly, empower and make the people proud to tell their own story to visitors in the community while also stimulating the local tourism industry. For a second intervention, I would say that by adding such accessible features, we will not only become a more inclusive community, but also create safer services that people can actually take advantage to and they feel safe doing so. And so for my last intervention, I would say that installing bilingual signage in key locations in the city will reduce the language, but most importantly, the cultural barrier that Spanish and English can create in a community and overall creating a closer knit community. So yes, this was my presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.